Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the Women Blaze Trails Festival. My name is Joe Gabreski, and I'll be your host for today. Friday was the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And so last year, to celebrate, we launched a 3-day virtual festival featuring women in science, exploration, conservation, adventure, engineering, photography, filmmaking, and more from all across the planet. So the goal is pretty simple. We want to celebrate incredible women doing incredible things around the world, day in and day out. So all weekend long, including today, we've been meeting women on the front lines of their fields, showcasing their stories, work, challenges, adventures, research, and expeditions. So this festival is hosted and organized by Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. Our goal is to inspire the next generation of scientists and explorers. We do this by bringing those on the front lines of science, exploration, and conservation live into classrooms across North America through virtual guest speakers and field trips. So since 2015, we've hosted over 3,000 live events, connecting 500,000 students with scientists and explorers in 95 countries. And the cornerstone of what we do is that it is and always will be free for classrooms everywhere. If you've never visited our site before, here is the link, exploringbytheseat.com. This month, we have probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 live events for classrooms to join in camera spots, tuning in live via YouTube, or even catching the events afterwards in their classrooms or at home. This month, we've kicked all the men out. All month long, we're hosting Women in Science and Exploration. So do check out the website, whether you're an educator, a parent, curious person to tune into some of these events live. On our YouTube channel, we probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 recorded events that you can check out anytime you want. And then this weekend, so far we have day 1 and day 2 of the festival in a playlist you can find on our channel. It's called Women Blaze Trails 2022. So anything you miss from this weekend, tune in anytime over the next couple of weeks in that playlist. All right, let us get our events rolling. We're going from 9 o'clock Eastern to 4 p.m. Eastern today. So 14 live events coming your way. And our first one is starting right now. We've got Holly O'Donnell joining us. She's a Scottish conservation biologist and expedition guide with a passion for tropical rainforests and understudied species. Her fieldwork has taken her to Antarctica, Zimbabwe, Paraguay, Ecuador, and Peru. For 2 years, she studied large mammal populations in the Peruvian Amazon. And now she's the Director of Research and Co-Chair of Science and Education Advisory Committee with the Acer Foundation. So let's bring her in live with us right now. Hey, Holly, how are you?
Hi, Joe. I'm really good, thank you.
That's good. It's great to see you joining us from the UK, from Scotland. We are excited to have you kicking off day 3 to get to know you a little bit better. So I'm going to hide myself away and let you take over for a bit.
Excellent, thank you. I'll just get my screen share.
All right, I see it coming in. Let me bring it up here.
Are we good?
Looks good.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, well, thank you for having me here today. I'm always delighted to speak for Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. I'm going to talk you through a little bit about me today and my career so far as a conservation biologist. So today I'll just very briefly take you through my professional and academic background, and I'll have a fieldwork focus on my work in the Peruvian Amazon, as well as briefly touching on my plans for the future. So firstly, let's go back in time to the early 1990s. I grew up in a coastal town in the northeast of Scotland called Invergordon. I think a big aspect of my childhood that inspired me to travel was probably our holidays abroad to Spanish islands and to the Canaries. I had a very outdoor childhood. I loved animals, although I didn't have a lot of pets. I had a rabbit. And a lot of walking, which coincidentally ended up being the main component of my work and job in Peru many, many years later. I studied for a Bachelor of Science in zoology at the University of St Andrews, which is in Scotland. Much of that degree was based on marine ecology, marine biology, and it included a really exciting field trip to the Antarctic. It was a 3-week trip. We travelled on an ecotourism boat, and we collected data on a variety of marine mammals and birds at the same time. I fundraised for this trip because it was very expensive, and I was very lucky to receive the support of my local community here in Scotland and sponsorship from a number of local businesses. When I graduated from St Andrews, I realised that I lacked field experience other than my 3 weeks in Antarctica. And I also wasn't entirely sure exactly what I wanted to do. I had some ideas that I wanted to study animal behaviour. I definitely wanted to work in conservation. I liked warm weather. So I went to Paraguay, a country which I knew absolutely nothing about before I went there. But I booked a 3-month internship with an NGO called Para la Tierra. And the reason I booked specifically here was that I could design and carry out my own research project, which I felt was really important experience that I hadn't gained yet. So I designed, with the help of another intern, a project on this species of mouse opossum, which you can see in the photograph. It's a little marsupial that lives in the trees and on the ground, and I had a project where I would walk around the forest every morning and I would open these little traps that you can see in the middle photograph called a Sherman trap, and I would collect various pieces of information on these mouse opossums, such as their weight, their sex, their age. And it was a really, really interesting project. Additionally, I had the opportunity to join in with other intern projects. So I gained a variety of experience really from monitoring lizards, monitoring frogs. I volunteered on the long-term primate project. I learned how to use a GPS. I learned how to trap bats in mist nets. Most importantly, and this is advice I would always give to people, I learned what I liked and what I didn't like, and it wasn't necessarily what I expected. So before going to Paraguay, I thought I wanted to be a primatologist. Jane Goodall was a huge inspiration to me growing up. And actually, when I was in Paraguay, I realised that although I loved walking through the forest tracking the primates, I was less interested in standing for hours recording their behaviour. And this led me to my second job in Peru, actually, where I found my area, the thing that really excited me. And it was very similar to Paraguay in terms of I liked walking through the forest, I liked finding animals, and I liked collecting data. But in Peru, I learned that actually I liked to quantify what I was finding. So I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But yeah, I flew for my first paid position, my first job, and it was as mammal team coordinator for an NGO called Fauna Forever in the Peruvian Amazon rainforest. This is a view, beautiful view you get when you fly in. So I started this job in 2015. The job comprised of rapid assessment surveys and baseline data collection of medium and large mammals. So what does that mean on a daily basis? That means camping in an area of rainforest that hadn't been surveyed before. And my job was to go out and collect information on the mammals in the area. But first, I'll show you a little bit about where we lived. We had to construct a tent, a kind of tent camp in the middle of the rainforest using the materials that were around us, led by some really skilled Peruvian construction workers, led by a man called Andreas, who is a genius to build what he did. This was our camp. It looks quite rustic. It was actually very homely in the end. It had a really great atmosphere. There was quite a lot of us working there. It was challenging at times. It was very rainy often, lots of mosquitoes. We spent the first few months in rubber boots because it was just too muddy to wear flip-flops. You can see over to the right some bunk beds. So that's where the majority of people slept. I set up a little tent because I like my own space. And this was my Holly's house. I tried to make a little garden and a yoga area. Yeah, pretty basic. Showering outside is actually really, really nice because the forest is around you. And our loo with a view, as we called it. The journey to this field site could be quite challenging. We would take first the highway, the interoceanic highway, followed by this dirt track, which if it rained could be, as you can see in the right, a bit of a struggle. And that was followed by a boat journey, just a short 20-minute boat journey up to the reserve where I spent much of my first year and a half in Peru. Again, the trails when we first moved in were quite flooded, but by the dry season it was a totally different situation and it was quite pleasant. So my job had two parts really. I collected data, but I also led volunteers and interns and trained them in data collection for medium and large mammals. And I really, really enjoyed that. So I suppose you could also say from this position, I learned that I like to teach people. So you can see there on the right, I'm standing on one of the trails that I've cut. In the top left, I'm standing with some of the volunteers who were helping me collect data. So my day-to-day work, we would get up at dawn or just before dawn, eat our breakfast in the dark, and then start what is called a line transect survey, which takes place on a trail, which we had to spend many weeks cutting with machetes first. Then you walk along this trail really slowly, really quietly, and you listen and you look and you record every mammal. So we're talking like anything larger than a squirrel that you see. You record it, you take a measurement of where it was exactly, you record the location, and all of this information can be used afterwards to create a picture of what wildlife is in the area, how much wildlife is in the area, and that can be monitored over time, and it can be compared between different areas. So the NGO I work for compare between, for example, areas used for logging, areas used for Brazil nut collection, areas used for conservation or ecotourism. So you can see here in this photo, I'm walking up front with my clipboard and my machete, and behind me are two volunteers who are helping me look for wildlife. There's a lot of wildlife in the Amazon rainforest. I could talk for hours about the biodiversity there. This photograph here, my friend Harry is imitating a jaguar that I saw in that precise spot, which I am still I've never seen a jaguar since then, I probably won't. It was an incredible sighting. It was very close. It did give me a fright. And it taught me to respect the rainforest. You know, I was quite confident walking on trails by myself, and it was a good reminder that I'm not the biggest animal here. But I was very, very lucky to have that encounter. A lot of wildlife in the Amazon is quite hidden, quite elusive. So it's not like going on a safari where you're going to see all of the large mammals immediately. It takes time, and I actually really enjoy that because you feel the reward. You know, you spend a long time there and you'll get a sighting that you really, really appreciate, rather than if you see something every single day. There are signs of these animals all around. On the left there, that's a tapir footprint on a beach, and on the right's a jaguar track. So although we often don't see these animals, we know they're there. The other way we know they're there are by using camera traps, which was the other part of my job. So as well as recording what animals are there and counting them, I also had to try and find evidence of the more elusive animals, the nocturnal animals. You know, you're not going to walk across a jaguar every day, so how do we know they're there? We put up these little cameras and you tie them to a tree, and it will record anything that walks in front of it. So I'm going to show you a minute or two of camera trap images of some of the species that we recorded on this area of land. So this is a mustelid called a tyra, which is like a large weasel, really. There's a third one coming along at the end there. This is a tapir, so this is the animal that left the track I showed you a few slides previously. It's the largest terrestrial mammal in South America. And coming up behind is a juvenile, almost fully grown, but you can just see the remains of some stripes on its stomach, which shows that it's a bit young. This is another tapir here. If you watch the nose, you'll see that the nose moves around. It's a prehensile nose. It's kind of like a short elephant trunk, and they use it to pick up leaves and vegetation. This is an ocelot, one of the more common cats that we capture in camera trap. Really, really pretty animal. And in a moment, yes, this is a puma. So this is one of the two larger cats alongside the jaguar. This is a coati. The males tend to be solitary and the females tend to live in groups. I think he knows the camera is there, but he's not quite sure. Off he goes. This is a jaguar. This is a jaguar walking through that campsite that I showed you some photographs of earlier. This was the the year later, we built a more permanent structure. And I just set up a camera trap to see what wildlife was already returning. So that was really cool to see. It's not a great video here, but it's a giant armadillo, which is an endangered species. It is absolutely massive. And the area that it's in, this clearing here, is a fire ant, leafcutter ant nest, sorry. So the armadillo comes in at night and he digs and digs, like you can see him there, and he'll dig down and eat some leafcutter ants. And this is one of the 2 deer species that are in the area. This is a collared peccary. There are 2 types of peccary there, white-lipped and collared. These collared peccary were quite common on the trails. This is another deer, a little young one, as you can see, with the spots. We only had a few camera traps. I think we had about 6 at this time, and I have hundreds and hundreds of videos of wildlife, so it really does show you how much is around, even though you're not seeing it every day. This is another curious ocelot. Often animals come up and smell the camera traps if you've handled them recently, if you've had insect repellent on your hands or sweat, and they'll smell you. This is another puma. This is a really cool animal called a grice, and it looks a little bit like a honey badger from Africa. Really, really rare to capture in camera. And another big jaguar. So showing camera trap images and videos is something that I love doing, whether it's on Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants in local schools, or there in Peru to colleagues and to school children. It's such a great way to show what wildlife is around. And I think education, environmental education, exciting people about what is in the land around them is really, really important. I did capture a really cool camera trap video while I was out there of a really elusive species called a short-eared dog. That was published and picked up by Monga Bay. There are 2 species of dogs in the Amazon, and they're both very little studied, not a lot is known about them. The recording that I made was of the short-eared dog eating an armadillo, which was a new recording for science. So after about a year and a half in Peru, I realised that I needed to kind of improve my academic career at that point. I felt I'd plateaued, I'd learned a lot, but I needed to go away and learn how to analyse my data. So that led me to Wild Crew at the University of Oxford, where I did a postgraduate diploma in international wildlife conservation practice. It was a really unique course. It's residential. There were only 9 of us. We're called Panthers, and an international group of people. So I learned so much just from dinner time conversations with my classmates. I then was awarded a scholarship to stay, and that turned into a job for a few years, where I continued to work at Wild Crew for the Trans-Kalahari Predator Programme. And that included 1 month in Zimbabwe, which was amazing. I saw so many animals I've only ever seen on television. And I learned a lot because we deployed a really large-scale camera trap survey. So although I'd used camera traps in the Amazon before, it was more to supplement the species list. This was my first formal training in how to deploy a camera trap grid that would give us some serious data that is published and used afterwards. So the picture on the bottom left there is a hyena, and I was so happy to see one in the wild, because my job actually back at Wild Crew was to sort through camera trap images of hyenas and assign them individual identities based on their coat patterns. So it was really cool to see one for real. That doesn't mean I stayed away from the Amazon completely. I was very lucky that my boss at Wild Crew allowed me to return to Peru, to the Amazon in the summer, where I work as an expedition guide for Tamandua expeditions. It has mainly a herpetology focus, but I still do mammal walks when people want them. And it allowed me to kind of keep my contacts in the region and keep on top of what was happening in terms of conservation. I think ecotourism is a really valuable tool in conservation if it's done properly. For example, Tamandua expeditions employ people who would otherwise be employed in other lines of work that might not be as safe for them, or as profitable, or as good for the environment. I also guide students, which is probably my favourite part. This is Radford University. And I particularly love working with other women, obviously some other young upcoming women in science. I think it's really amazing the projects that these students come out and carry out, and I learn a lot from them as well. I do, just to come back to this, I do think ecotourism is important. I think not everybody can go maybe to the Amazon rainforest to experience it, and that's completely understandable. It is expensive. But I think whether it's at home, whether it's abroad, whether it's just in your backyard, finding something that you're passionate about, finding your little patch of nature that you can enjoy. Because David Attenborough said, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they've never experienced. And I think that is accurate. My job at the moment, since I finished with Wild Crew, I work for the Asir Foundation, which is a US-based nonprofit. They work in Peru in the same area that I've worked for years. They first awarded me a conservation fellowship in 2020 when they found my social media account. And that turned into a position as Director of Research, although due to the pandemic and lack of travel, I mainly manage their social media accounts. However, it's actually, I think, quite an important point to raise. I enjoy social media. I've kind of just played with it for a few years, and somehow that ended up as a proper job. So I think my message there really is, if you enjoy sharing your stories, your conservation stories, don't be scared to do that. Because you never know, it might lead to all sorts of other opportunities. And I think conservation can be so competitive when it comes to jobs. It's so underfunded that if you have another skill like social media or writing blogs or anything like that, then it can really help you with your career further down the line. At the moment, I'm in the process of applying for a PhD. That is hopefully the next step in my career, where I can design and carry out a research project back in the Peruvian Amazon with real conservation implications. So hopefully next time I speak to you, I will have started that project. And in the meantime, I just want to finish with a quote from Jane Goodall, who really was the woman in science who inspired me to start this path when I was just 7 years old. And yeah, now I welcome any of your questions. Thank you for listening.
Awesome, Holly. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking us into some of your adventures in the Amazon. It truly is an amazing and beautiful place. I can only imagine how much you've learned and experienced from being there, the amazing collaborations, the friendships. It looks like, you know, when you're working in the field, you become really close to the people who you're around. And
yeah,
not surprising, right? You count on them day in and day out.
Yeah, that's a huge part of it. It really, really is. You make the best friends in the world, and people I haven't seen for 2 years, but I still talk to every day. Yeah. All
right. So we have questions already coming in via the chat. Here's the first one here. You mentioned that conservation is competitive. So they're just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on that. What did you mean by that, and why is it like that?
I think what I mean is that there are a lot of people applying for the same jobs in conservation, and it's competitive in the sense that it's so underfunded for starters that you often need to pay for experience or volunteer before you are even going to be considered for a paid position, which if you worked in another field, you would probably graduate and be hired immediately. So it creates great, there's a lot of, it's unfair. You know, it's biased towards people who can afford to pay for these experiences, who have the time to be able to volunteer. So it's really, really difficult to make your way in conservation. I meet a lot of young graduates who do have experience, but they're applying for jobs with hundreds of applicants and they're just not getting anywhere. And another issue is that people with PhDs are often hired for positions that are that don't require a PhD. So like a data management position, there will be so many applicants that people who have PhDs will be hired, and it just makes it really, really hard for people earlier in their career to get somewhere. So I think my advice is always to try and have like a little like side skill that you can try to use to further yourself.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. There's you know, anyone you talk to in science and conservation always talks about how field work is, you know, the most exciting part. It's, you know, lots of work in the office, of course, you're crunching the data after you finish your field work and such, but those times in the field are the most valuable, the most exciting. So it's not surprising at all that there is competition for those positions. And yeah, like you mentioned, there's lots of volunteer positions, which is a great way to get started and maybe establish yourself with some of those organizations. But if you don't have that funding in the first place, it definitely can leave some people behind.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, you've spent a lot of time in the field, whether it's on projects like the camera trapping or ecotourism and things like that. So I wonder, in your experiences, have you run into any issues, being a woman in the field? Are there any challenges that have stood out to you, or do you find that once you're out in the field with everybody, it doesn't matter as much?
I think it is definitely more challenging as a woman. It probably varies a lot depending on where you are and what the situation is. I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I think in general, depending on what country you're working in and what culture you're surrounded by, proving yourself as a woman can often be a lot more challenging. So I definitely had that challenge in Peru with some of my Peruvian colleagues, because me as a female scientist in that role was kind of not the cultural norm. So even just when it comes down to things like physical ability, there is obviously a limit. So I might not be as strong as some of my male colleagues when it comes to macheting a trail or carrying things. So in some instances, I might have to accept help. But if you accept help too much, then it looks like you can't do anything. So you have to constantly kind of prove that you're physically very, very capable. And yeah, I've had some situations where I was maybe macheting trails and would get left behind, or my machetes would go missing because other people wanted to go machete the trail because they didn't think a woman should be doing it. So it's a difficult kind of balance to find, where you need to show that you want to do this work, that you can do this work, but also you don't want to upset people and you want to respect the culture that you're working in. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it looks like from some of the images you shared, you do get to work and meet some amazing women in the field as well. So it's great to see that there's colleagues and young scientists, conservationists who are kind of making a name for themselves as well, and proving that they can do that work and be out there in the field. Yeah,
absolutely. And a lot of those women help lift each other up, which I think is really great. There's a great community of female conservationists out there.
Awesome. Well, one more question here. You talked about ecotourism and some of the guiding you've done. So what do you think responsible ecotourism looks like?
Big question. I think, again, probably it's context specific, but a few general things would be, it absolutely needs to benefit the local people in the local community. You cannot go into an area and just make money and leave. It needs to first and foremost be benefiting that community, that area. So for example, providing alternative livelihoods, I think, is really important. Ecotourism does provide a lot of jobs for a lot of people. Those jobs should be fairly paid and compensated. So it can be very, very valuable. Some other rules, again, just respect, general respect. If tour groups are going through communities, it's not an opportunity just to go and take photos of people living their normal life. So I think a lot of cultural respect has to be there as well. But yeah, the big takeaway is it has to benefit the local community, and it has to be something that people in that country and area want there.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And done properly, it does provide great livelihood for those in the community. It can help, steer people away from putting too much pressure on natural resources when there's the incentive to protect the area. Nobody wants to destroy the place that they live, right? Nobody wants to do that. But sometimes circumstance, when it's about survival, circumstance leads to things like that. So yeah, definitely responsible. Definitely with Indigenous communities and their voices heard and having a real role in that ecotourism. Awesome. Well, Holly, I'm always great to host you. Always great to have you joining us. It's exciting to hear that you'll hopefully be getting back out into the field soon. I know that COVID has changed a lot of things for people getting out into the field, but it sounds to me like you'll be back there soon, back where you love to be, and maybe getting in on some of that camera trapping action again. So I think that might be my final question for today is, with the camera traps, what kind of unique behaviors have you been able to observe that you wouldn't otherwise be able to because these animals are so elusive?
Yeah, I mean, some of it can just be quite basic, recording the presence of an animal in an area that you wouldn't normally expect it to be or hasn't been recorded before. Going back to the short-eared dog recording, that was really interesting because I found a dead armadillo and I put a camera trap there, and a short-eared dog came and scavenged the meat. And that was not known, had not been published before. It was thought that these dogs ate fish and seeds. So that was like a cool dietary behavior, I suppose, that had been recorded on a camera trap. And I'm sure there's a lot more out there that people have recorded. I think a lot of new species range is always found on camera traps. Definitely species that are not normally in areas or interacting with other species. You might see, I think a friend of mine recorded 2 species of monkey that normally compete highly with each other, recorded them in the same area eating clay from a mineral lick. So that was quite interesting as well.
All right, very cool. Well, Holly, again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for kicking off day 3. Hopefully you can tune into a little bit more that is happening today. And yeah, I can't wait for our next connection with students, maybe even live from the field. Should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that would be amazing, hopefully.
All right. Well, Holly, enjoy your Sunday. I know it's afternoon for you. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk soon.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.